Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey, not to the thrilling raids or the epic sagas, but into a darker, more uncomfortable corner of the Viking world, the brutal reality of Viking law and order. You might imagine a strict code of justice, but trust me, the truth was often chaotic, personal, and profoundly unforgiving. A quick reality check. You, with your belief in police forces and fair trials, probably wouldn't last a single week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might think that Viking law involved judges in robes and orderly courtrooms. But for the Vikings, justice was dispensed in a far more chaotic and often intimidating setting, the assembly, a chaotic court known as the Thing. Forget quiet deliberations. This was a public gathering where disputes were aired, laws were proclaimed, and fates were decided, often without formal procedure or a clear separation of powers. Imagine yourself as a Viking, perhaps accused of a minor transgression, or seeking justice for a wrong committed against you. You travel, often long distances, to the Thingvellir assembly fields, a designated outdoor meeting place. The air is thick with the murmurs of hundreds, even thousands of people gathered. Farmers, warriors, chieftains, and common folk. This isn't a silent, solemn court. It's a bustling, often raucous assembly, more like a lively market or political rally than a modern courtroom. You hear the shouts, the arguments, the distant clang of weapons, and the pervasive buzz of a restless crowd. At the heart of the thing is the law rock Lögberg, a prominent stone or rise where the Lögsögumadur law speaker would stand. This individual wasn't a judge in the modern sense. He was the reciter of the law, memorizing and reciting the ancient oral laws for all to hear. Imagine him, a figure of immense authority, his voice booming over the gathered crowd, proclaiming the established customs and precedents. But there were no written law codes in the early Viking Age, making the law speaker's memory and interpretation paramount. A common historical fact is that the Icelandic Althing, one of the most famous and well-preserved things, relied on the law speaker's oral recitation for centuries before laws were written down. When a dispute arose, it wasn't presented by lawyers. You, the accuser or the accused, would have to present your own case. Imagine standing before the assembled freemen, called Godar chieftains and other prominent figures, who would act as a kind of jury. You would have to clearly articulate your grievance or your defense, often without a script, relying on your eloquence, your reputation, and the support of your kinsmen. Your testimony could be challenged directly by your opponent, or by anyone in the assembly, leading to heated arguments and emotional outbursts. There was no strict concept of evidence as we understand it. Reputation, oaths, and the support of influential individuals often carried more weight than tangible proof. The atmosphere was often intimidating and chaotic. Powerful chieftains and their armed retainers would be present, their allegiances often swaying the outcome. Imagine the subtle pressure, the unspoken threats, as you present your case, knowing that a powerful Godi might silently oppose you, or that your opponent's kinsmen might glare at you menacingly. Decisions were made by consensus among the free men, often through shouting, murmuring, or a show of support for one side or the other. It was a court ruled by public opinion and the subtle or not-so-subtle influence of the powerful, rather than strict legal precedent. There was no formal police force to enforce judgments. If you were found guilty, or if a judgment was made in your favor, it was often up to you or your family to enforce the verdict. Imagine being granted compensation for a wrong, but having to rely on your own strength and reputation to collect it from a defiant opponent. This decentralized system often led to prolonged disputes, the escalation of violence, and the pervasive reality of blood feuds, which we'll discuss further. Even the penalties themselves were often informal. For minor offenses, fines or compensation might be ordered. For serious crimes, however, the outcomes were stark and brutal outlawry banishment or death. There was no concept of modern imprisonment. The thing was about resolving disputes and maintaining a fragile social order through direct, often harsh means. The overall impression of the thing was one of raw, democratic power, but also immense personal vulnerability. You were directly exposed to public scrutiny, to powerful interests, and to the unpredictable moods of a large, armed assembly. Justice was not a detached, impartial process. It was a deeply personal, often confrontational, and highly public affair, shaped by the reputations and strength of the individuals involved. So, as you hear the distant murmur of an imaginary ancient assembly, remember that for you in the Viking Age, the pursuit of justice was a chaotic, intimidating, and deeply personal ordeal. The assembly was a volatile court where your fate hung in the balance. Decided not by impartial law, but by the will of the crowd and the influence of powerful men. It certainly makes you appreciate a quiet courtroom and due process, doesn't it? For the Vikings, law and order was often a loud, public gamble. You've just experienced the chaotic, often intimidating, atmosphere of the Viking thing, where justice was a public and volatile affair. But even when the thing concluded, true order was often a fleeting concept. Instead, a deeply ingrained and terrifying reality dominated Viking society blood feuds. Endless vengeance. Forget impartial legal systems. This was a pervasive cycle of honor-driven killings and retaliations that could consume families and communities for generations, making justice a deeply personal, often violent, and unending pursuit. Imagine yourself as a Viking, perhaps a farmer or a warrior. A wrong has been committed against your family. Maybe your brother was killed in a dispute over land, or your cousin was publicly insulted. In Viking society, personal honor vig and the honor of your family yet were paramount. An offense against one was an offense against all, and it demanded satisfaction. There was no central police force, no king's justice waiting to step in. It was up to you and your kinsmen to seek redress. A common historical fact is that Icelandic sagas, our primary sources for this period, are filled with detailed accounts of blood feuds, showing their central role in Viking society. The first step was often to seek compensation wurgild at the thing. If the accused was found guilty, a monetary payment would be set for the offense, calculated based on the severity of the crime and the status of the victim. Imagine the solemn calculation: a certain amount for a lost eye, a larger sum for a killing, with higher status individuals having a higher price on their heads. This was an attempt to resolve disputes peacefully, to put a monetary value on human life and injury. You'd wait anxiously, hoping the thing would rule in your favor, and that the opponent would agree to pay. But here's the brutal reality: the compensation often wasn't enough. Or the offending party might refuse to pay. Or the honor of your family was so deeply wounded that only blood vengeance would suffice. Imagine the simmering resentment, the burning desire for retribution that would consume you and your family. If compensation failed, or was deemed insufficient, the ancient right to vengeance took precedence. This meant that you, or a close kinsman, had the right, and indeed the social expectation, to take a life from the offending family, or inflict a similar injury. This initiated the blood feud. Imagine the chilling cycle: your family kills a member of the offending family. But this doesn't end it. It merely shifts the balance, creating a new grievance that their family must now avenge. You become locked in a terrifying dance of death, where violence begets violence, endlessly. You live in a constant state of vigilance, knowing that at any moment, members of the opposing family could seek you out or ambush your kinsman. You sleep with a weapon close by, your senses heightened, constantly scanning for danger. Your family, your was your primary source of protection and support. If you committed a killing, your kinsmen were expected to stand by you, to offer you shelter, to help you fight, and to potentially suffer the consequences alongside you. Imagine the immense pressure of this shared responsibility. knowing that your actions could bring danger and death upon your entire family, but that failing to act could bring them shame. Historians still debate the specific social mechanisms that sometimes allowed feuds to be resolved versus perpetuated indefinitely, often involving mediation by powerful chieftains or a final, decisive act of vengeance that discouraged further retaliation. The feuds could drag on for years, even generations. Children would grow up knowing who their family's enemies were, inheriting the grudges and the right to vengeance. Imagine being taught from a young age that certain families were your sworn enemies, that their deaths were a matter of honor, and that you might one day have to participate in their killing. This indoctrination into a culture of vengeance ensured the continuity of the feuds, making true peace a rare and fragile commodity. The landscape itself became a canvas for these feuds. Certain paths might be avoided, certain homesteads seen as dangerous. Travel would become perilous, as you might encounter your enemies far from the safety of the thing. The very fabric of society was torn by these ongoing conflicts, where personal grievances could quickly escalate into widespread violence, turning communities into battlegrounds. So, as you hear the distant echoes of a sharp argument, remember that for you in the Viking Age, justice was rarely delivered by an impartial hand. Instead, it was often pursued through a terrifying, relentless cycle of blood feuds, where honor demanded vengeance, and violence begot more violence, consuming families in an unending spiral of retribution. It certainly makes you appreciate modern police forces and judicial systems that aim to prevent private wars. Doesn't it for the Vikings, a wrong often meant a lifelong, bloody pursuit of justice? You've just been immersed in the terrifying reality of Viking blood feuds, an endless cycle of honor-driven vengeance. But if you truly defied Viking society, or committed an unforgivable act that could not be settled by a fine or a feud, a far more chilling fate awaited outlawry, living death sentence. Forget prisons or even a quick execution. This was banishment from society. Stripped of all protection, condemned to wander as an outcast, hunted and utterly vulnerable? Imagine yourself, now accused of a heinous crime, perhaps a major theft, a deliberate killing outside the bounds of a feud, or simply defying the most powerful chieftains at the thing. The assembly, after hearing your case, pronounces the gravest sentence short of immediate death outlawry skoganger, literally forest going. Your heart sinks with a cold dread because you understand what this truly means. You are no longer a part of society. All your rights and protections are immediately revoked. Imagine being stripped of your family's support, your clan's protection, and your standing in the community. You cannot seek justice, own property, or even participate in any legal proceedings. You are declared Nightinger, a villain, a man without honor or rights. The most terrifying aspect is that it becomes legal for anyone to kill you without consequence. Your life is literally forfeit, without any legal protection whatsoever. You are now fair game, a hunted animal. A common historical fact is that in Iceland, the laws of the Commonwealth stated that an outlaw could be killed without penalty, and anyone who offered him aid would themselves become outlaws. Your home is no longer safe. You must flee. Immediately. Imagine gathering what few possessions you can carry, perhaps a weapon and some meager food, and slipping away into the wilderness. You are an exile, forced to abandon your family, your farm, your entire life. There's no appeal, no coming back. Your former life is irrevocably shattered. Life as an outlaw is a brutal, constant struggle for survival against both nature and human hunters. Imagine trudging through dense forests, across desolate mountains, or along remote coastlines, always looking over your shoulder. Every shadow could hide an enemy seeking to claim the reward for your head. Every rustle in the leaves could be a pursuer. You sleep rough, exposed to the elements. Constantly cold, wet, and hungry. Food is scarce, you must hunt and forage, always in fear of being discovered. Your clothes quickly become ragged, your body gaunt, your face hardened by constant fear and deprivation. Trust is a dangerous luxury. You cannot seek shelter in villages or farms, because anyone who offers you aid risks sharing your fate. Imagine the profound loneliness of being utterly alone, cut off from all human contact, knowing that every face you encounter could belong to someone looking to kill you. You are stripped of community, the very bedrock of Viking society. The psychological toll of this extreme isolation, paranoia, and the constant threat of death would be immense, driving many to madness or despair. Historians still debate the specific survival strategies of outlaws, and whether some managed to form small, temporary communities or relied on secret family aid. But long-term survival was exceptionally difficult. The physical dangers are constant. You're exposed to the brutal northern climate, with its long, dark, freezing winters. Wild animals like wolves and bears become predators, not just symbols. Accidents, illness, or injury in your isolated state would almost certainly be fatal, as there's no one to offer aid or care. Imagine falling and breaking a leg in the wilderness, knowing that your slow, agonizing death is now inevitable. The ultimate goal of outlawry was not just to remove the offender, but to terrify any others who might consider breaking the most sacred laws. The existence of outlaws, hunted and desperate, served as a chilling living example of the consequences of defying the thing and the established social order. Their desperate plight was a constant reminder that individual freedom was conditional, reliant on adherence to community norms. So, as you hear the distant whispers of wind through imaginary trees, remember that for you in the Viking Age, the ultimate punishment was a living death. Outlawry was a brutal sentence of banishment, stripping you of all protection, condemning you to a life of constant fear, utter loneliness, and the certainty of eventually falling to either nature or the sword. It certainly makes you profoundly grateful for modern legal protections and the right to rehabilitation. Doesn't it for the Vikings? Breaking the law could literally cast you out of the world. You've just been condemned to the living death of outlawry, banished from Viking society and stripped of all protection. But for those times when a legal dispute couldn't be resolved by fines, or when one party's honor was so deeply wounded that only a direct confrontation would suffice, Viking law offered a terrifying resolution trial by combat. Might makes right. Forget impartial juries. This was a brutal, often fatal, method of resolving disputes through physical combat, where divine judgment was believed to be revealed through the strength of the sword arm. Imagine yourself standing before the assembled free men at the thing. You have a dispute with another Viking, perhaps a contested land claim, an accusation of slander, or a grave insult to your honor that cannot be settled with vergild. All attempts at negotiation have failed. Finally, the thing declares that the matter will be settled by holmgang, a formal duel. Your heart pounds with a mix of fear and grim determination, because you know your life now hinges on your skill with a weapon. A common historical fact is that trial by combat, including holmgang, was a legal procedure in Viking and other Germanic societies, sometimes seen as a way for the gods to reveal truth. The duel itself was highly ritualized, but no less deadly. It often took place on a small, marked piece of ground, sometimes on a specific holm small island or a designated fighting space. Imagine the two of you, stripped to the waist or wearing minimal protective gear, facing each other. You might use swords, axes, or shields, depending on the agreed-upon terms. The crowd watches in grim silence, their breath held, as the fate of two men hangs in the balance. The rules, while varying, often allowed for several rounds or specific conditions. It wasn't always a fight to the death immediately. Sometimes the first to draw blood, or the first to be disarmed, was considered the loser. But in many cases, it was a brutal, no-holds-barred fight until one combatant was incapacitated or killed. Imagine the exhaustion, the raw physical pain as you exchange blows, your muscles screaming, your breath coming in ragged gasps. Every parry, every strike, every step is a desperate gamble. You are fighting for your honor, your reputation, your property, and ultimately, your very life. Historians still debate the specific rules and variations of holmgang across different regions and time periods, but its role as a violent legal resolution is clear. The brutality of the combat was undeniable. These weren't elegant duels, they were savage, desperate struggles. You hear the clang of metal on metal, the heavy thud of axes, the grunts of exertion. You see blood splattering on the ground, limbs flailing, faces contorted in pain and effort. A sword might hack into flesh, an axe might shatter a shield, or a shield might be used to brutally bash an opponent. You're fighting for your life, aiming to inflict maximum damage on your opponent while trying to avoid a fatal blow yourself. The line between victory and agonizing defeat is razor thin, and the consequences of losing were absolute. If you were killed, your family might still owe compensation for the original dispute, and your honor would be forever tarnished by your defeat. If you were simply defeated and wounded, you might lose your property, your reputation, and carry the physical scars of your failure for the rest of your life. Imagine the humiliation of being defeated, perhaps maimed, knowing that this public loss of honor would haunt you and your family forever. The belief underpinning trial by combat was that the gods would favor the just party, granting them strength and victory. Thus, the outcome of the duel was seen as a divine judgment, a pronouncement from the deities themselves. Imagine knowing that not just your strength, but your very righteousness was being judged in this bloody arena. This added an immense psychological burden to the physical peril. Scholars still debate the extent to which the belief in divine judgment truly influenced the outcome of these duels versus sheer physical prowess and skill. But the cultural belief was strong. For the Vikings, this system, while brutal, offered a definitive resolution to disputes that might otherwise fester into prolonged blood feuds. It was a way to settle matters, albeit a terrifying one, when all other means had failed. It emphasized individual strength, courage, and the willingness to stand up for one's honor. Values deeply ingrained in Viking society, so, as you hear the distant clang of imaginary swords, remember that for you in the Viking Age, justice could be a brutal, personal matter. Trial by combat was a terrifying resolution, a duel to the death where might often made right. And your fate was decided not by legal argument, but by the strength of your arm and the will of the gods. It certainly makes you appreciate modern courtrooms and peaceful legal resolutions, doesn't it? For the Vikings, the law's final word often came with a brutal, bloody exclamation mark. Bloody, you've just survived the terrifying ordeal of trial by combat, a brutal resolution where might often made right. But for the Vikings, not every wrong ended in blood or banishment. Instead, a complex system of monetary payments often served as the primary form of justice, creating a chilling reality: fines and compensations, the price of blood. Forget modern concepts of doing time for a crime. In Viking society, almost every transgression, even murder, had a set monetary value, turning justice into a transaction, where wealth often trumped retribution. Imagine yourself as a Viking, either as a victim seeking justice or as an offender facing consequences. You're at the Thing, the assembly where laws are declared and disputes are settled. If a crime has been committed, perhaps an injury, a theft, or even a killing, the primary form of redress is usually not imprisonment or execution, but a fine or compensation wergild. A common historical fact is that wergild, literally man price, was a central concept in early Germanic law, valuing every individual life and injury with a specific monetary amount. The calculations would be meticulous. Imagine the law speaker or prominent chieftains determining the exact amount of silver, cattle, or other valuable goods you would have to pay or receive. Every injury had a set price, a certain amount for a lost eye, a specific sum for a broken arm, a larger payment for a major wound, and for a killing. The wergild was the price of a man's life, varying based on his social status, his wealth, and his reputation. Imagine the chilling objectivity of this system. where human suffering and life itself were reduced to quantifiable monetary values. It was a clear, if brutal, tariff on violence. For you, as the offender, paying the fine was paramount. If you could pay the weregild, you could avoid the terrifying consequences of outlawry or a blood feud. Imagine scrambling to gather the necessary wealth, perhaps selling land, mortgaging your future, or relying on your family's resources. Failure to pay meant escalating conflict, leading to the brutal blood feud we discussed earlier, or ultimately to your banishment and utter vulnerability. The threat of violence or social ruin was the ultimate enforcer of these financial penalties. Historians still debate the extent to which Vergild truly prevented blood feuds versus merely delaying or formalizing them, but it was clearly a primary mechanism for attempted peaceful resolution. For you as the victim, or your family, receiving the compensation was a crucial, if sometimes unsatisfying, form of justice. It wouldn't bring back a lost loved one, but it would provide a tangible means of support and a public acknowledgement of the wrong committed. Imagine the complex emotions of receiving payment for the death of a family member, a mix of relief, enduring grief, and perhaps a lingering sense that simple money could not truly atone for blood. This system of fines meant that wealth often played a significant role in justice. A rich man, even if he committed a serious crime, might be able to pay his way out of a blood feud or outlawry, whereas a poor man committing a lesser offense might face dire consequences simply because he couldn't afford the compensation. Imagine the stark reality: justice was not always blind. It often favored those with deep pockets, creating a clear social divide in the application of law. This wasn't a system based on rehabilitation or punishment fitting the crime in a moral sense. It was about maintaining social order through economic means. The process of collecting the fine could also be fraught with danger. If the offending party was reluctant to pay, you, as the recipient, might have to resort to legal distress, seizing their property, or even threatening violence to ensure payment. This could easily escalate into a fresh conflict, turning a legal dispute back into a violent one. So, as you hear the distant clink of imaginary silver, remember that for you in the Viking Age, justice often came with a price tag. Fines and compensations were the currency of justice, turning even life and death into a financial transaction. This system, while attempting to limit violence, often highlighted the brutal reality that wealth could literally buy you out of mortal peril, shaping a legal landscape where the price of blood was very real. It certainly makes you appreciate modern judicial systems that don't allow murderers to simply pay off their victims' families, doesn't it? For the Vikings, money literally talked, and sometimes it bought lives. You've just learned about the intriguing system of fines and compensations, where even life had a price tag in Viking society. But if you were truly unfortunate or committed a crime deemed unforgivable by a powerful chieftain, your punishment could take a far more horrifying form: slavery as punishment, loss of self. Forget paying a fine. This was the ultimate degradation, condemning you to a life of relentless toil, abuse, and the complete stripping away of your identity and human dignity. Imagine yourself, now a convicted criminal in the Viking Age. Perhaps you committed a serious theft, deeply offended a powerful family, or lost a trial by combat in a way that left you indebted and dishonored. The judgment is pronounced: you are to become a thrall, the Old Norse term for slave. Your heart sinks with an icy dread, because you understand that this is a living death, a fate arguably worse than being outlawed. A common historical fact is that while Viking society was composed of free farmers and chieftains, slavery was a fundamental institution, often fueled by raiding, but also by legal condemnation and debt. Your immediate reality is one of profound loss of freedom and identity. You are no longer a free person, Carl or Jarl. You are now Ain, property, a tool, a chattel. Imagine being stripped of your name. Your family connections as your children born into thraldom would also be thralls, belonging to your master and your social standing. You become a mere possession, bought and sold, traded, or given away at your master's whim. Your body, your labor, your very being no longer belongs to you. This is a terrifying erasure of who you once were. Your new life is defined by relentless, grueling labor. Depending on your master, you could be assigned to any task. Imagine being forced to work in the fields, clearing land, plowing, sowing, and harvesting with primitive tools from dawn till dusk under all weather conditions. Your muscles would constantly ache, your hands would be raw and calloused, and your body would be perpetually exhausted. Or you might be sent to fell trees in dense forests, enduring the cold and the physical danger of heavy timber. You could be forced to work in mines or quarries, facing the same brutal conditions we discussed when exploring Roman slavery. There was no rest, no respite, only unending toil. Your living conditions would be deplorable. You'd likely sleep on rough straw mats in cramped, unsanitary quarters, perhaps in a separate hut or a designated section of the longhouse, often chained to prevent escape. Imagine the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies, waste, and stale food. Your diet would be meager, typically gruel, coarse bread, and scraps, just enough to keep you alive and working, but never enough to truly nourish you. Malnutrition, disease, and parasitic infestations would be constant companions, unchecked by any form of effective medicine. You would be perpetually hungry, cold, and itchy. Archaeological evidence from thrall burial sites or living quarters, though rare, suggests a diet often poorer than that of free peasants, and a higher prevalence of nutritional deficiencies and injuries. The constant threat of brutal physical abuse from your master or overseer was a daily reality. There was no legal recourse for a thrall. Your master could beat you, whip you, maim you, or even kill you without facing any legal consequences. Imagine the constant fear, the need to anticipate your master's moods, the absolute subservience required to avoid the lash. You would witness other thralls being brutalized, serving as chilling warnings of your own precarious existence. Your cries would fall on deaf ears. Sexual exploitation, particularly for female thralls, was also a grim reality, as their bodies were considered property to be used at will by their masters or male family members. Imagine the constant vulnerability, the profound violation, and the utter powerlessness in such situations. Escape was incredibly difficult and dangerous. If caught, a runaway thrall faced even more brutal punishment, often permanent mutilation, or a slow, agonizing death, designed to terrify other thralls and deter any further attempts at freedom. The odds of successfully fleeing and remaining free were almost non-existent in a society where your status was visible, and escape meant utter outlawry. The psychological toll of being a thrall was immense. Your spirit would be slowly eroded by the constant degradation, the endless toil, the pervasive fear, and the absolute lack of hope. You would be forced to suppress your emotions, your dignity, your very sense of self, becoming a hollow shell. Your dreams, if you dared to have them, would be of freedom, a state that seemed utterly unattainable. So, as you hear the distant clang of imagined chains, remember that for you in the Viking Age, certain crimes could condemn you to a fate far worse than death. Slavery as punishment was a brutal reality, stripping you of your identity, your humanity, and condemning you to a life of endless suffering and utter degradation. A stark testament to the unforgiving nature of Viking law and order, it certainly makes you profoundly grateful for legal systems that value human dignity and offer rehabilitation, doesn't it? For the Vikings, the ultimate price for transgression was the complete loss of self. You've just been condemned to the brutal reality of slavery as punishment. A terrifying loss of self in Viking society, but if you manage to avoid outlawry, trial by combat, or outright enslavement, you still wouldn't find anything resembling a comfortable prison cell. Instead, you would confront the stark truth of the absence of prison's justice abroad. Forget formal incarceration. Viking law relied on banishment, fines, or death as primary outcomes, often forcing offenders to seek their own justice in foreign lands or face the ultimate Lonely end. Imagine yourself as a Viking, found guilty of a serious offense that warrants more than a fine, but not immediate execution. The thing, the assembly, pronounces its judgment, and you realize there's no mention of a jail, a dungeon, or any place of long-term confinement. The concept of prisons as places to hold, rehabilitate, or even simply detain criminals for extended periods was largely absent in Viking society. Their justice system was swift, and its outcomes were stark. Instead of a cell, your primary punishment might be outlawry, which we discussed earlier. Imagine being declared a wolf in the sacred place, stripped of all legal protections, and forced to flee into the wilderness, where anyone could kill you without consequence. This wasn't a gentle banishment, it was a living death sentence, pushing you to the fringes of survival, utterly alone and vulnerable. You are your own jailer, trapped by the boundaries of society's acceptance. A common historical fact is that Skoganger outlawry was indeed a primary punishment in Iceland's Commonwealth, a land with no central authority to enforce prisons. For those who committed capital crimes, or whose offenses were particularly heinous, the punishment was often immediate execution. Imagine being led away from the thing directly to a place of execution, where your life would be taken swiftly, either by axe, spear, or hanging. There was no long period of waiting in a cell, no appeals process. Justice was often final and immediate. Your existence as a threat to society was ended, not confined. But what if you were a less severe offender? Perhaps a lesser chieftain who had lost a political struggle, or someone who had caused a major grievance that needed to be resolved without full-scale feud or outlawry. Your punishment might be a period of forced exile or a journey abroad. Imagine being compelled by the thing or by a powerful chieftain to leave your homeland for a set period, or even indefinitely. You'd be expected to seek your fortune, or simply stay out of trouble. In foreign lands, this was a form of sending you away rather than locking you up. You'd essentially self-deport, relying on your own resources to survive in a new, unfamiliar environment. This often meant turning to raiding or mercenary work. Imagine yourself, a skilled warrior or sailor, now forced to leave your home. Your only viable option to earn a living, to gain wealth, and perhaps eventually to restore your honor, might be to join a raiding party to England, Francia, or the Slavic lands, or to become a mercenary for a distant king or emperor, fighting battles far from home. This wasn't punishment in a modern sense, it was a redirection of energy, turning a problem individual into an asset or a problem for someone else. You're not in a prison, but you're still not truly free, bound by the necessity of survival and the grim realities of warfare abroad. Historians still debate the extent to which Viking raiding was fueled by specific legal punishments like exile versus general economic pressures or a quest for glory. However, it certainly provided an outlet for those seeking a new life or escape from past deeds. The lack of formal prisons meant that Viking society relied heavily on social pressure, reputation, and the threat of severe immediate consequences to maintain order. Your standing in the community, your family's honor, and the fear of outlawry or death were the ultimate deterrents. There were no hidden institutions to disappear offenders. Their fates were public, stark, and final. Justice was personal, communal, and often very visible. So, as you hear the distant sounds of wind across an empty landscape, remember that for you in the Viking Age, justice rarely involved iron bars. Instead, it was a brutal choice outlawry, death, or being forced to find your justice and livelihood in a foreign land. The absence of prisons meant that Viking law and order was fundamentally about banishment or elimination, leaving little room for confined rehabilitation. It certainly makes you appreciate a secure, if unglamorous, jail cell, doesn't it? For the Vikings, freedom was often a luxury, and punishment meant being cast out, or worse, ended. You've just confronted the brutal reality of Viking justice without prisons, where banishment or death were the primary outcomes. But even within this decentralized system, there were powerful figures who could bend influence, or outright manipulate the law, the power of the chieftain. Forget truly impartial justice. The truth was often the arbitrary nature of a local leader's authority in enforcing or shaping the law, making your fate deeply dependent on his whims and allegiances. Imagine yourself as a Viking commoner, a farmer, or a craftsman. You have a dispute with a neighbor, or perhaps a more serious grievance against a powerful individual. You bring your case to the thing, the local assembly, but even at the thing, where free men theoretically had a voice, the outcome was heavily influenced by the chieftain's godar. These weren't elected officials in our modern sense. They were powerful, often hereditary, leaders who commanded respect, wealth, and a following of loyal kinsmen and warriors. Their authority was personal, not institutional. A common historical fact is that the godar in Iceland, for example, were not just religious leaders but also judges, arbitrators, and military commanders holding immense local power. The chieftain's power derived from his ability to attract and maintain followers. He would gather around him a herd household retinue of loyal warriors who would fight for him, enforce his will, and support him at the thing. Imagine bringing your case against someone and seeing their opponent surrounded by dozens of armed, intimidating warriors loyal to their chieftain. The sheer display of force, the implicit threat, would often be enough to sway the assembly or intimidate you into dropping your claim. Justice was not just about legal arguments, it was about who had the most powerful backing. A chieftain could enforce the law or ignore it, based on his own interests. If you had a powerful chieftain as your patron, he could use his influence to ensure your case was heard favorably, or that a judgment against you was lenient. Imagine a chieftain speaking on your behalf, his voice carrying immense weight simply because of who he was. Conversely, if you crossed a chieftain or lacked a powerful patron, you could find yourself on the wrong side of a judgment, with little hope of redress. Your safety, your property, and your very life were often at the mercy of a local chieftain's favor, or lack thereof. This led to the arbitrary nature of justice. The law might be recited orally by the law speaker, but its application was often subjective, influenced by personal relationships, rivalries between chieftains, and raw power dynamics. Imagine arguing your case, knowing that the law speaker might be subtly biased, or that a powerful goatee might whisper in his ear. The outcome of a trial could feel less like a fair judgment and more like a political chess match, where the most influential player often won. Historians still debate the extent to which the Icelandic Commonwealth, despite its elaborate legal system, truly achieved impartial justice given the powerful role of the godar. Some argue the system was designed to manage feuds, not necessarily to eliminate power imbalances. A chieftain could also act as an arbitrator or mediator in disputes, especially blood feuds. Imagine two warring families, locked in a cycle of vengeance. A powerful chieftain might step in, using his authority and influence to negotiate a settlement, demanding vergild or some other form of compensation to end the bloodshed. While this could be a merciful intervention, it also solidified the chieftain's power, as both sides would then owe him deference for resolving the conflict. The very absence of a centralized king or state meant that chieftains filled the power vacuum, becoming the ultimate enforcers of law and order within their local sphere of influence. Their authority wasn't granted by a distant monarch. It was built on their reputation, their wealth, their charisma, and their ability to command loyalty and wield force. This made them indispensable for maintaining some semblance of order, but also terrifying in their arbitrary power. So, as you hear the distant shouts from an imaginary assembly, remember that for you in the Viking Age, your fate was often in the hands of a powerful chieftain. Their authority, their whims, and their allegiances could determine whether you received justice, suffered punishment, or found yourself an outlaw. It certainly makes you appreciate a clear separation of powers and an independent judiciary, doesn't it? For the Vikings, the law was often a tool, wielded by the strong. You've just explored the arbitrary power of the chieftain in Viking law, where justice often bent to influence and personal might. But even with chieftains mediating and fines being paid, a deep-seated cultural instinct often overrode formal legal channels, vengeance, and personal retribution. Forget police investigations and state-enforced penalties. The truth was a pervasive emphasis on individual or family-led justice, often pursued outside formal channels, turning grievances into violent, relentless personal quests for satisfaction. Imagine yourself as a Viking, and a grave wrong has been committed against you or your family. Perhaps your honor has been publicly insulted, your property stolen, or, most tragically, a loved one has been killed. While the thing might offer a legal path to compensation, a deep part of Viking culture, rooted in ancient traditions, demanded something more visceral, personal retribution. This wasn't just about justice, it was about honorvig and reputation, drengerskaper, about showing that your family would not be wronged without consequences. A common historical fact is that the Icelandic sagas are replete with examples of individual and family vengeance. Illustrating its central role in society, the first instinct would often be to seek satisfaction directly. Imagine confronting the offender, or a member of his family, face to face. This could escalate quickly from heated words to a violent brawl, or a full-scale ambush. You wouldn't wait for a chieftain or a formal assembly. The immediate impulse to redress the wrong, to exact retribution, was incredibly powerful. Your family and kinsmen would be expected to stand with you, offering support, weapons, and their own lives in pursuit of this personal vengeance. To shy away from such a confrontation, to let a wrong go unpunished, would bring shame not just upon yourself, but upon your entire lineage. This emphasis on personal retribution led directly to the blood feud, which we've discussed before, but it bears repeating its pervasiveness. It was a cycle of violence where one killing begot another, seemingly without end. Imagine your cousin murdering an opponent, only for that opponent's family to seek vengeance against your own, killing your brother in return. You then have a duty to avenge your brother, continuing the spiral. You lived in a constant state of vigilance, knowing that at any moment, members of an opposing family could seek you out or ambush your kinsmen. You slept with a weapon close by, your senses heightened, constantly scanning for danger because peace was a rare commodity. The concept of honor was a driving force behind this relentless pursuit. To allow an insult to stand, or a wrong to go unavenged, was to lose honor. And in Viking society, honor was everything. It determined your standing in the community, your reputation as a warrior, and your family's prestige. Imagine being constantly driven by this intangible force, compelled to act violently, even when it meant risking your own life, because the alternative was the profound shame of being seen as weak or cowardly. This made vengeance not just a right, but a moral imperative. Historians still debate the extent to which the sagas romanticize or accurately reflect the frequency and severity of blood feuds, but their fundamental place in the Viking legal and social system is undeniable. Even when legal solutions like wergild compensation were offered, they often fell short of satisfying the deep-seated desire for personal retribution. While monetary compensation might formally end a dispute, the emotional scars and the personal need for vengeance could linger, sometimes erupting years later, outside the formal bounds of the thing. Imagine accepting silver for a lost loved one, but still feeling the burning desire for blood, a silent promise to yourself that true justice had yet to be served. The environment itself fostered this culture of personal justice. With vast, often untamed lands and a decentralized authority, individuals and families often had to be their own protectors and enforcers of justice. There was no overarching state power to guarantee safety or impose impartial judgments in every instance. This placed immense pressure on individuals to be strong, to be capable of defending themselves, and to be willing to exact retribution when necessary. So, as you hear the distant echoes of a sharp argument, remember that for you in the Viking Age, justice was rarely delivered by an impartial state. Instead, it was often a deeply personal, relentless quest for vengeance and retribution, driven by an unforgiving code of honor. Your safety was your own responsibility, and a wrong committed against you demanded a direct, often violent, response. It certainly makes you appreciate modern police forces and the rule of law, which largely prevent private citizens from taking justice into their own hands. Doesn't it for the Vikings? An eye for an eye was not just a saying, it was often the brutal personal reality of their law and order. You've just explored the pervasive reality of vengeance and personal retribution, a deep-seated cultural instinct that shaped Viking law and order. Now, as our journey through the brutal realities of Viking justice concludes, let's reflect on its most overarching characteristic law's edge, the unforgiving frontier. Forget clean-cut legal systems. Viking law, though structured, always yielded to brute force, the harsh realities of survival, and the ultimate, often violent, truth that might often made right in a world constantly teetering on the brink of chaos. Imagine yourself as a Viking, navigating your daily life. You understand the laws, the customs, and the rulings of the thing. You know about wergild and outlawry, but beneath this intricate legal framework, you are always aware of a deeper, more brutal reality. The ultimate arbiter is often strength. If you are strong, or if you have powerful kinsmen and loyal warriors, you have a better chance of seeing justice done in your favor, or escaping the full consequences of your actions. If you are weak or without powerful allies, the law's protections become incredibly thin. A common historical fact is that even within the legal framework of the thing, powerful chieftains often use their influence and armed retinues to sway legal outcomes or enforce their will. The absence of a centralized, state-enforced police force or prison system meant that justice was always personal, and enforcement was always a challenge. If you were owed wergild, you had to collect it yourself, or with the aid of your family. Imagine confronting a reluctant payer or a defiant criminal, knowing that you might have to resort to threats, intimidation, or even violence to ensure the judgment was honored. The law provided the right, but you had to provide the might. This constantly pushed society to the edge of private warfare, making every legal dispute a potential escalation of violence. The legal system was a sophisticated mechanism for managing disputes and attempting to prevent total anarchy, but it rarely eliminated the potential for brutal outcomes. It was a means to channel violence and to formalize conflicts, but not to eradicate them. Imagine a society constantly balancing on this razor's edge, where a minor argument could quickly spiral into a blood feud, and a legal ruling could simply be ignored if one party was powerful enough to defy it. Historians still debate the extent to which Viking law was truly law as we understand it, versus a complex system of dispute resolution that often prioritized pragmatic outcomes over abstract justice. The harsh realities of the environment and survival also constantly pushed law to its edge. In a world of scarcity, raiding was often a more expedient way to acquire wealth than tedious trade or farming. While raids on fellow Norsemen might be condemned by law, raids on foreign lands were often glorified. This created a dual morality, where the law applied differently depending on who you were and where you were. Imagine living with this blurred line, understanding that what was a crime at home might be a heroic deed abroad. The constant threat of outlawry exemplifies law's edge. Being cast out of society was the ultimate legal punishment, precisely because there was no other safety net. It demonstrated that beyond the bounds of accepted community, there was nothing but a brutal, unforgiving wilderness where law ceased to exist, and only brute survival mattered. The laws were strong within the community, but outside they simply vanished. This inherent brutality and reliance on strength shaped the Viking psyche. It instilled a deep sense of self-reliance and a warrior mentality. You learned that you could only truly depend on your own strength, your own cunning, and the loyalty of your immediate kin. This fostered a pragmatic, often ruthless approach to life, where survival often meant being harder, faster, and more willing to use force than your opponent. The law wasn't a compassionate protector, it was a framework within which you constantly had to assert your own power. So, as you hear the distant echoes of Viking shouts, remember that their law and order, while providing a structure, ultimately existed on a brutal frontier. It was a system where strength often dictated outcomes, where justice was frequently a personal burden to enforce, and where chaos was always lurking just beyond the edge of the assembly. It certainly makes you appreciate a world where the rule of law is ideally applied equally and enforced by independent institutions. Doesn't it for the Vikings? Law was a blunt instrument, and its edge was always unforgiving. You have completed a journey through the brutal realities of Viking law and order. We have explored the chaotic thing sessions, the endless feuds, the living death penalty for outlaws, the bloody trials by combat, the cold fines and reparations, the slavery as a punishment, the absence of prisons and justice in foreign lands, the arbitrary power of chieftains, the profound emphasis on personal vendetta, and finally the ruthless nature of law on a harsh frontier. As you drift off to sleep, let the images of the struggles for justice, the harsh judgments, and the resilience of a society constantly on the brink of chaos fade away. It is a poignant reminder that even with laws, life can be a constant battle, where strength and survival often have the last word.